Hello, everyone. My name is Rene Odanga. I am a graduate assistant at the Center for African Studies at Howard University. I am also a graduate student in the Department of African Studies. I want to welcome you all to this conversation. I can see some familiar faces. Dr. Helen Bond is here, Dr. Alma Zodi. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for being with us today. We want to have a conversation on when we started planning this event, it was the recently concluded Kenyan election, but not so much anymore. So we want to talk about what that means, what the election has had to teach us, what it has had to show us, a bit of commentary on that. And then so how this is going to work is I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to move from there into a brief moment of then observations and reflections and so forth. And then we can do a short conversation between myself and them. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. You can either put your questions in the chat, or when we get to the point of the Q&A, you can raise up your hand. That's a Kenyanism. Raise your hand, and then I'll select you to ask your question. But I want you to all feel very welcome. Unfortunately, Dr. Njoki Wamai sends her regards. She's not able to join us today because of a scheduling conflict, but that's okay. I figure we'll still have some robust conversation. And in a future iteration of this event, she should be able to join us. But receive her greetings all the same. With that said, I want to introduce our panelists. I believe I've already introduced myself and the Center for African Studies. What I'm going to do as time continues, I shall put the website to the Center for African Studies so that you can sign up for our newsletter and keep in touch with the events and programming. Also, I want to pass the regards of the director, Dr. Kristin Johnson. She should be joining us in a moment. I look forward to that, but she sends her regards in the meantime. So with that said, I will introduce our panelists in order of how I'm seeing them on the screen. Mariga Thoithi is a Kenyan impact professional with a love for problem solving. I hope he would wave. He's worked in various communications, campaigns, and advocacy positions across East, Southern, and West Africa, and is currently a master's student in the 2021-2022 cohort of the University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Masters of Public Administration. Kristin Muthui is a PhD student working on sustainable development and adaptation to climate change or resilience in low-income countries. She's interested in the relationships between democracy, natural resource governance, and climate change, as well as how people conceptualize the future. Silvana Swekesa is a research associate with the African Leadership Center, King's College London. He holds a BA degree in History and Political Studies from Kenyatta University and a master's degree in Security, Leadership, and Society from King's College London. Wakesa has recently completed his doctorate in leadership studies with reference to security and development at King's College London. His thesis is titled Leadership and the Politics of Borderland Communities, Integration, Peace and Security in the East African Community, and it examines the EAC's efforts to address the security challenges posed by the situation of borderland communities in the region. His research seeks to understand the common insecurities witnessed in two borderlands and the leadership dynamics involved in addressing these insecurities within the EAC framework. His other research interests include examining the role of regional economic groups in promoting peace building and security, and Kenya's foreign policy towards the AU and other African regional communities, non-institutional or alternative approaches to peace building and security sector reform in post-conflict societies, and football. So that's Silvana. So we're going to be our panelists for the day. I shall open up by throwing Mariga into the the deep end of the pool. So he shall start because he's on this side of my screen. Just give us a few of your observations on the elections, what you found interesting, what you found boring. But of course, we shall unpack that term boring in a moment.
Thank you, Rene. So I'll jump right in to say that I think I condensed the major electoral issues into 5, which I'll just discuss very briefly, which I feel we can expand on. So number 1 is electoral reforms. So as globally, electoral bodies are the center of democracy. And we came off the back of 3 bungled elections. And we came off the back of the annulled 2017 election. So the shift from the ECK to the IEBC was supposed to herald a new change, but in many ways didn't. The 2017 election was supposed to be in many ways the Waterloo moment after the annulment of the election, and major changes were expected but never actually implemented. The IEBC made a lot of positive reforms going forward, including what is now the game changer of the electronic transmission, live electronic transmission of the forms. However, there's still many issues that were left unsaid. There are a lot of issues left unaddressed after 2017 election, specifically because of how it was left afterwards. The handshake agreement, which shifted everything, basically put political expediency and wheeler dealing over electoral reforms, and all the fights that were fought for, especially around the 2017 election, was simply silenced right after that. And so there's been a lot of silence between then and 2 weeks before this election, when these issues have suddenly emerged and we suddenly remember that they are significant. That's issue number 1 about electoral reforms. Number 2 is about the lenses through which we view our elections. We still have a very westernized view of elections, and we have a view that centers violence, which is why one of the most impressive things externally to people was that there's no violence before, during, or just after the election. There's no more depth to the analysis. We view the elections through the tribal or communal lenses, but not allowing for, as Dr. Njoya said, more stories and more complex views. We don't allow for viewing of our electoral choices through viewing history, multiple facets of identity, ideology, personal and national philosophies, and it's one of the reasons we understand very little about our voters. A conversation with a friend here in the UK who asked me about the electoral choices in Kenya, and they asked me whether our main candidates were left, right, or center, made me realize that we need a new language, because left, right, or center does not merely encapsulate what our democratic process feels like. Number 3 is institutions. It's been a great movement to view institutional capacity and the independence and ability to keep the executive in check. Elections are always a very crucial point at which you can analyze this. There's a very strong set of independent commissions set up after the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution, with experienced commissioners and very big budgets. These were brought down and broken down very subsequently over time, over the past decade, and you can see the results now. You can see the differences in the level of commissions and commissioners, and that's played a very big role in that. It's brought into questions institutions like the judiciary, right, which has been severely and documentedly underfunded for the past 10 years, especially after the 2017 election, which is annulled. So seen as a direct implementation of the president's threat on the judiciary after the election. And it brings into question a lot of these institutions and their capability to hold the executive in check. Number 4 is the trust and integrity deficit in the electoral system. The current version of IBC's operations has been adapted to bridge the electoral trust deficit. Technology wasn't introduced to increase efficiency. It was introduced to address the lack of integrity. And as expected, it still hasn't done this. Tech should solve efficiency. Integrity should be addressed through institutional changes and strengthening. But this brings another very core discussion to it about how to bridge trust and integrity deficit discussion. And number 5 would be the voter turnout, or what is deemed as voter apathy. Right? We had a 64 to 65% voter turnout, which by most standards in different countries is a decent standard. By the Kenyan standard of the last elections, really low. Brought about a full discussion on electoral choices, right? What's the choice, what choices we have and what the choices are in context. How democratic are the democratic processes, including nominations, the choices representative of who people want in the office. It also delves deep into things like who is attracted to political office and why they're attracted to it, followed by who's actually allowed to run for political office and how the structures allow for equalization of the playing field, including the Election Financing Act, which was fought by Parliament. A very quick example of that is how the court ruling on the CDF being found unconstitutional has completely shifted a lot of things, including the amount of petitions at the parliamentary level, which have drastically almost reduced. People are conceding defeat immediately when they get it. And number 6, which I might expound on later, that people would, this seems like for the first time, the emergence of a class-based and economy-based election. It's a very big shift in which the economy and economic matters have become center and fore of the election. So I feel that that's the crux and part of the crucial things that I've noticed about this election broadly across.
We shall return to you and your observations in a while. There's a lot to unpack there. We shall get to it in a while. Kristin.
Hi, everyone. So let me start with some of my observations. Thanks, Mariga. You've made a lot of very good and a lot of very concise points. So I'm just going to add on. So for me, the most important thing, or the most satisfying thing, I would say, was seeing how the process of the Constitution played out. And by that, I mean, we've now had enough time to see some of these processes that were introduced, and some of these processes and all the governorship positions and the whole devolution process. It's sort of coming of age. And so we've seen some important differences. For example, in a poll before the elections, they found that I think it's the position of the governorship and the MCA, which are second and third, and almost tied with the position of the presidency. So that means that devolution is actually important and people do care about their local leadership. The second one was the female reps. The female reps and the gender rule has been a really, really long and a really frustrating conversation and struggle, but it's also starting to bear fruit. For a long time, people were saying that female reps are useless, etc. But suddenly in this election, we have a huge number of women who've been elected into positions that are not women representative. So there's a clear pipeline for leadership. That's not to say that women are particularly better leaders, and I've made jokes that maybe for the first time we can be able to do some research and find out how they build patronage networks and abuse of office as women. But it's still, for me, that's a good thing to see, because it means that women rep function is serving as it should. The third one was about election narratives. There's an election narrative that comes up all the time, which is that people don't know how to vote and people don't vote for the leaders that they should be voting for. But even if you look at the manifestos that were presented, there are no significant differences, at least not in spirit. If you look at the economic plan, broadly the same thing. A lot of wanting to continue with what was already put in place, which is what planning should also be. It should be about continuity. If you talk about corruption, how do you measure corruption? These are issues about personal integrity, and you're given a choice between people who've all been in power, who've all collaborated with each other, who've all fought for some things and who've been against for some other things. So it's very difficult to claim that somebody should make an objective choice. Nonetheless, something that we see in every Kenyan election is that a huge number of incumbents go home anyways. So that means that people do use the power that they're given, and they continue to do so, except that it doesn't seem to be enough. Mariga also mentioned a lack of ideology. I think this is a problem that is becoming more and more widespread worldwide, I would say. And I think one of the reasons this happens is because a lot of problems or a lot of economic issues that we have are actually beyond our control. These are structural issues that would require political solutions that go beyond national borders. So even as people form political or economic plans, they have to form them in a very, very restrained context. And so perhaps we end up focusing on integrity and corruption. And so we can't really have plans that are very, very strongly left-wing or right-wing or whatever you want to call it. Something I'm curious about, I've been listening in a little bit on other conversations, and I'm hearing comments from other Africans. Some Zimbabweans especially extremely upset about how Kenyans set precedents for elections and power sharing and other things. And so I'm actually just curious about the role of media, the role of fake news. I know in the last elections, we had massive problems with that. And I'm just wondering if we had any improvements, any new things that we learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sylvanus. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rene. And thank you to my two colleagues. I think coming the third person is basically you have to summarize what the rest of the people have said. But for me, this election being the third election after the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution, there are a couple of factors that I observed in the whole process. So number one, is the issue of political parties. We are all aware that the 2010 Constitution tried to institutionalize the role of political parties in our governance system. And observing across, now that political parties are being funded by the taxpayers, there seems to be a huge task ahead in institutionalizing the whole concept of democracy within the parties. As we witnessed the nominations for the different seats, there is still a lot of hard work to be done, because all of them, honestly, some of them don't even fit to be called a democratic process, because there was a lot of handpicking, there was a lot of violence here and there. And the women really bore the most brunt in terms of the skullduggery nature of the political parties nominations. Number two, the role of the media has to be really examined in this election. According to the Media Council of Kenya, the media was very biased, was very blatantly biased towards one side of the political divide. And perhaps that can be looked at in terms of how our media is owned. So if the owners lean to one side, then it becomes very difficult for you to maintain your independence, when it's a classic case of he who pays the piper calls the tune. So the role of the media will come under scrutiny. And this can be mixed together with the election itself in terms of how the results were being reported. The Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission chair came out and said, in the course of planning, they had advised the media to pull their resources together to come up with a tallying center that both of them will report. But unfortunately, both of them went separate ways, and the confusion we saw in terms of reporting, one media group reporting this, another one reporting this, came up because of that. So the role of the media going forward, perhaps we have to look at it. The issue of fake news, and misinformation in this election, it has been quite high. It has been, perhaps not to the scale of the Cambridge Analytica of 2017, but misinformation and fake news and propaganda has increased in a very high manner. And we've seen situations where even the leading key political actors blatantly share doctored videos as authentic proof. And up to now, the National Cohesion Commission never condemned those people. None of them were ever investigated or even brought before a court of law. So misinformation and fake news remains a key thing. Fourthly, violence meted against the election officials is rampantly still very high. As we speak, the returning officer of Embakasi East was found dead, murdered. An election official in Elders constituency in Wajir was shot and had his leg amputated. And just yesterday, we saw the Office of the Public Prosecutor meeting with the presiding officers and returning officers, and them reporting how much intimidation and threats and what is there going on. And even at the National Tallying Center in Bomas, we saw how political actors physically assaulted electoral officials on live camera. And up to today, no action has been taken against those individuals. They are still roaming free. And some of them even appear on national television and actually boasting and saying, you can come arrest me if you want, I'll do it right again. So for me, the conduct of political actors, I think we've elevated them to such a level that they can't account for their interest. Fifthly, as I summarize, I think also this election, for once, we tried to speak about issues as opposed to the usual ethnicity building blocks. I say that because perhaps coincidentally, the elections happened at a time when the world was just recovering from a global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the Russia-Ukraine conflict that heavily affected the supply chains in the world. So the cost of living went extremely high. And I think the politicians were forced to respond to some of these issues in their campaign, which I think was a plus to the voters, because at least now they could interrogate some of the policies they were saying. Lastly, in terms of, again, back to the issues, I think in terms of political manifestos and what the political parties and groups were offering, we still lag behind, because majority, the two leading coalition groups released their manifestos either a month to the election or 2 months to the election. So it's very difficult perhaps for people to interrogate deeply and ask questions exactly what the plans were. But overall, in my opinion, the election process was very peaceful. And I think we've had a high number of people who have conceded peacefully without any issues, especially the lower seats. Of course, we might see disputes here and there, but the whole process, I think the voting, the campaigns, and even the tallying and the announcement of results, it's only the presidential result that still seems to have an issue. But on the general scale, I think the whole election, we need to at least give the devil its due. They tried their level best.
So what Sylvanus, you call peaceful and you know, others have called boring. So this is that part where I promised you would come back to that term, because this election has been called boring both by Kenyans and by the media. I'm interested in what that term means. When people say this is the most boring election in history. Now, of course, someone like Nanjala Nyabola has said it is boring because there are other more interesting things going on in the Kenyan political landscape. It is boring because we seem to have moved away from the point where the presidential election is the most important thing that is happening. Kristin mentioned that devolution seems to work. But there's also that it is boring of why are you people not uprooting railways yet? Why are you people not fighting in the street? Why have GSU not been sent with tear gas canisters? And perhaps that's not necessarily anything important that we need to address, but we might have to address it anyway, because we did see commentary coming out after the announcement of the result, and when there were protests in Kondele, that now finally international media have gotten what they came for. That what we mean by the election is boring is that Kenyans are not misbehaving. They're not giving us the show that we signed up for. Every time we remember Kenya exists every 5 years, we want to get there and see some people hurling epithets we did not even know existed and fighting each other. That's what an entertaining election in Kenya looks like. It's not necessarily that the ideologies are revolutionary, because some of the ideologies that we saw, some of the voting points that we saw being brought to the fore, like George Ojakoya's point on the legalization of marijuana, while it might be interesting in certain senses, it certainly is interesting in that we are having a conversation at the national level on marijuana in a way Kenyans claiming to be conservative never did in the past. Whether or not it's feasible is different. So I want us to talk about that term, boring. Starting with Mariga again, we're going with the way the appearance of my screen. What does that term mean, and what are the problematics of it?
Part of it is what we know, what the center is for normal, right? It's boring compared to what, right? So if you go back and just go back the past 3 decades, right? So you look at the 92 election, you go to 97, then 2002, when people felt like there's a heralding of like a new dawn, and Kibaki came in. And then after that, there's been contested elections like all the way through, right? So you've had elections annulled in 2013, which critics say shouldn't have been annulled. And then you had 2017, you had 2 different elections. I think boring is exactly the way elections are supposed to be. I think we're just not used to it. Because so right before the Kibaki era and the Moi era, I don't consider those elections, right? Because in 1992, what YK92 was paid to do is basically to bribe the whole country. Because that's exactly where it's literally documented where like the YK92 group made their money. They were given like a ton of money. There's no elections happening at that point. At best, Matiba was rigged out very clearly. And so at this point is that when the elections suddenly moved to a space where they're suddenly more competitive and we're moving forward, then there's unfortunately been a lot of instigation, tribal-based grouping and alliances forced by politicians, and violence instigated. And the violence, the one term I usually move away from is post-election violence. None of it is ever post-election violence. All of it is clearly strategized, funded violence that happens all the way before elections. It happened in 2013, 2017 in both elections. And so in many ways, for the people who are voting, I think we have to give age context for the voters, right? Anyone born in the year 2000 is now 22. We're having people born in the year 2004 voting now, which means that their first interaction with elections at best, at least when they're a child in terms of cognition, wasn't in 2007. It had to be at least 2013, right? So that's their first idea of like conscious spaces in which elections happen. And for many of the people who are voting, because when people broke down the electoral voting block into the 18 to 25, that's what they have seen. That is literally their lifetime. They have seen a lifetime of violence and upheaval during the election period. This is the first time at which the elections happened, people went to work the next day, right? For many people, first of all, for many journalists, and a couple of journalists were called out online and had to like 2 media houses retracted their stories. They saw a bit, they saw a bit of discontent and protest and immediately filed a story that violence existed. Many people aren't used to it. And I feel that goes back to my initial point of we cannot view our elections to any point apart from violence. And so it needs a very big reawakening on the lenses through which we view the elections. What do we view? Because what the success is right now is that we haven't burnt the country down. The success in many ways hasn't been it hasn't been an interrogation of the IABC. No one's been looking at 2017, what the election ruling said, versus the structure now, whether all these gaps were met, whether the judiciary's capacity was increased, whether the NCIC has been curbing down on hate speech, whether when you look at the Cambridge Analytica, as Kristin talked about, whether any of these things were measured and in terms of how social media was monitored. A lot of these things haven't been analyzed because we're only looking at the one thing, which is presence or absence of violence.
So thank you for that. I told you from the very beginning that I would ask about that. But coming off of that, because you mentioned things like YK92, I was hoping you'd touch on 1988 Mlolongo, which was an interesting type of voting. So if you're coming all the way from 1988 till today, I want to ask Kristin, this is for you, something that well, I'm hearing of, I'm just not sure what it means. I do know what it means though. The commentary that is coming out of all conversations on, say, voter apathy, ideology, so on and so forth, is we are not teaching our youth our political history. That we are existing in a time, Mariga, you've put it very well, that someone born in 2004 is voting. What that means is that this person was not alive by no fault of their own to see what the announcement of Kibaki's election was, because there was a lot of crying and yote yawezekana bila moi. There was a lot of euphoria. We are having for the first time an electorate that is divorced from such landmark moments in Kenyan electoralism. That apparently means that they are automatically detached from Kenya's history. I'm not sure what's going on there. Do you feel that do you think there's anything you have to speak towards that, Kristin?
I find that a statement very confusing, because I struggle to understand how understanding history or understanding the role that our opposition leaders played in the past would have an influence on your choice of voting today. Because, for example, I mean, the fact is we had the champion of the opposition running as a successor to the government. And even without knowing anything about the history of your country, that would in itself be very confusing. And then you have the vice president running as the opposition. And I really struggle to understand how a deep understanding of, for example, the fight for multi-party elections, the Mlolongo process, the post-election violence, how would that affect somebody's knowledge and understanding and voting choice today? Maybe, I don't know. I personally, when I speak to my younger siblings, they sound just as cynical as a typical Kenyan. And I think the reasons that people didn't vote, maybe they're not even, we'll find out when we get polls, but they might not be as profound as we think they are. They might just be that there's no real compelling narrative to go out and vote. The voting turnout is going back to the level it was before, I think it was multi-party elections. So we're kind of going back to, or going into a new kind of normal. And if there's really nothing, if there's no burning, the world is burning down tomorrow, a lot of people might just not turn out to vote because maybe they don't like the face of the person who's on the poster, or I don't know, they watch 5 minutes of news every day. You know, we have to some extent, I really think it's unfair to expect people to have this long and rich and profound understanding of everything before they can make decisions. I think we should make information available to people in a way that they understand it.
Thank you.
I answered your question.
Well, you did in a manner of, in a certain sense, you did. Sylvanus, Kristin, I mentioned.
I mean, I'll have to come in where Mariga, I think, left and Kristin. I mean, we are doing a huge disservice trying to blame, I think, one section of the society for perhaps the way the outcome was. And I have read a couple of pieces that have come out of this election, people saying that the youth, we've failed to teach the youth about the history, and perhaps that is why the outcome we have at the moment. And my question is, why are we forcing the youth to forget what has happened in the last 20 years or 10 years and force them to remember what happened the earlier 20 years between the 1990s and the 1980s? So you want to force the youth to remember that we had a second liberation that was fought for. But again, you want them also to forget that even after this second liberation, these same people who fought for the second liberation, they have contributed to the decay of the economy, of the government and the state. So you want us to say, okay, young people, forget what they've done to the country in the last 10 years, but remember what they did to the country in the previous year because they fought for the second liberation. And I think we are doing a very huge disservice to this population, because at the end of the day, this election comes at a time when they are faced with what the so-called Generation Z. You know, what Mariga says, these people were born in after 2000. So when you tell them, I fought for the second liberation in 1992, and they literally ask you, so what? You know, what exactly are you bringing to us? Do we eat the liberation? You know, and there's a whole plethora of data on it, even across the African continent. You see liberation party movements struggling to sustain that narrative over and over. You know, people say, like, for instance, in this election, that the selection of Martha Karua to become a running mate, the first woman to be a running mate in a bigger coalition, is progressive. But you forget that these are the same people who came up with the whole BBI charade, you know? So when are we blaming the old people for giving us bad choices too? You get it? So for me, we are doing much disservice in trying to blame one segment for the outcome of this election. I think we need to unpack and look at exactly what is it that is making the people behave the way they are behaving. One lot going to Kenya Kwanza, one lot going to Azimio la Umoja. And I genuinely don't believe this election was boring, because we had a very unique election. The deputy president keeps on referring it as a mongrel of a situation. We have a deputy president running as the opposition candidate, and the opposition candidate running as the government candidate. I mean, that's unheard of. For me, that was very, very entertaining to hear the deputy president attack his own government, and the opposition candidate can't attack the government he was opposing. He's forced to defend it. And you even saw, like, he couldn't even say, my government is gonna do this, because he don't want to antagonize the people who are supporting him. On the issue of boring, again, I think once it's documented, I think the role of music, I mean, we forced a 77-year-old to go to the studio and record a song to come and sing. I mean, for me, that was quite telling, that there was something that was happening, you know? So I think for me, it was a very entertaining election. It wasn't boring. And the music, if you study the music that came out of this election, I hope somebody has curated it, and we will check into Spotify and find the Kenyan music election. I think that was very brilliant.
Now, something was mentioned at the beginning, class as an actual interest point in voting. Now, class in Kenya is a very touchy topic to touch on, because of its history, because of the creation of a Kenyan class. I want to touch on that because I want to bring it in, because I think Kristin is the one who used a very interesting term, called a certain part of the running parties a coalition of the compromised. And that is the thing in Kenyan politics. When class is brought in as a marker, it horribly complicates everything. The reason I'm asking about this is because I'm not entirely sure that bringing in class as a marker in election, as a rallying point in election is entirely, I think we have reached the apotheosis of a very toxic thing that, and I think Dr. Wandia just wrote something off of the elephant on it. If we are saying that we've reached the point where it's class, not ethnicity, I'm not defending ethnicity, then we are saying we've reached the realization of the Swinnerton plan, which was the creation of a Kenyan bourgeoisie that will then have the interests of the colonial metropole, so on and so forth, right? If we are saying that, what does class has become an actual rallying point in the election? People are voting a class interest, not an ethnicity interest. What does that mean, and how do we think about it? Kristin, I'll start with you.
Personally, I think that this, I assume you're referring to the wheelbarrow narrative, wheelbarrow and hustlers.
And hustlers.
Okay. I think this is a very clever way to disguise what is intra-elite warfare. And because in a sense, it is kind of true that this is actually a war between the elites, and maybe it's a war that is also has consequences for us, because it's a war between like Uhuru Kenyatta, so the president, and the founding fathers, and basically a version of state capture that is, I am the state. So it is the family, the president of the family, they own all the land, and they have a lot of commercial interests that they can protect and expand during by using political power. And then we have the new elites, which are his vice president and other people. And so using those narratives of wheelbarrows and hustlers is, for me, it's just a way to disguise warfare between the two. I really can't say much more beyond that. I think it's very difficult to talk about class in a society like Kenya, which is largely agrarian. I think 70% of the population in any case live on less than $1 a day. So if we're thinking about class, we have to really think a lot harder about what we mean. Yeah. Maybe I'll add something on.
So I agree with Kristin to an extent, right? It is, at best, this is an intra-elitist fight. However, what I disagree with is whether it was necessary or not. I think I liked the eventual end discussion. How it came about, again, politics won't ever give you the cleanest of ways in which topics are introduced. However, it does like bring very important conversations to the fore, right? First of all, as like what we call new money versus old money in Kenya, right? Anytime someone tells me they're old money, it's probably really dodgily. If you look back, it's political money or corruption money, hands down 99% of the time. And we don't even have enough long money. We're not a country which is 430 years old. So long money at best is a politician who came in 1960, or a home guard who was there in 1930. That's the longest money that we have in terms of like when we're looking at what the length of money is. And so like overcoming it, which is pretty simple, is like what people, because what I realized is this, one of the biggest mistakes one political group made was making this a morality or ethics discussion, right? People are not unaware of how their politicians made their money. It's always a very interesting thing to look at, right? And it literally goes back to that over whether it's what people are aware of how their politicians made their money. I think the biggest difference is that people have become numb in some sense, numb due to what they've seen over decades to the how the money was made. So the discussion here wasn't that I am poor right now. The discussion was that you could come from nowhere and be where I am. And unfortunately, living in a society where there honestly is no incentive for integrity, right? Like I think Justine Omai brought it up really well, that you can't sell education, you can't sell all these things to people when they see that none of them lead anywhere. So what people were eventually looking at in many, once the class discussion came up, is where they are, where, like, for example, the deputy president was, is that there are two narratives which are true, right? One narrative is that he is a billionaire right now. That's very truly accurate. So it is an intra-elite struggle. However, the next narrative that is true, that he was poor. He was dirt poor. He did have nothing getting into the university. And there's a lot of leveraging of specifically that point, because that point in many ways resonates with a lot of people and where they are. I've had multiple people tell me that it's not a matter of who steals or not, because all of them do steal. The question is like the deputy president brought up a very interesting thing, which I think one of the things he tried to bring up intentionally was what they tried to sell as class mobility as a discussion. They were basically trying to convince people that you could move from where. The truth is that by statistics, there's barely any class mobility in Kenya. The biggest determinant for whether you're going to become rich or not is whether your parents are rich or not, that's it. However, the narrative being set up by most people is that if you take away corruption, since they feel that all politicians are corrupt, is that only one of these candidates was selling to them the fact that you could move from being this poor kid somewhere in the middle of rural Kenya to being the deputy vice president. And unfortunately, that's a very big rallying call. And it's a very big question around whether class mobility exists. And since education doesn't seem to have bridged the barrier, then what institutionally and structurally would be able to bridge that barrier? And I feel it became a very big discussion. It was, of course, it was brought politically by the discussion, but I feel it was a very crucial discussion that should be moved forward in terms of expanding on it.
Sylvanus, you will do a response on that, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
I agree with Mariga because, yeah, the class mobility in Kenya, perhaps, in my opinion, the whole hustler dynasty narrative was, in my opinion, was just an intra-elite competition gone wrong. So there was a disagreement among the elites, and they decided, one of them decided, you know what, perhaps I'll run out of this narrative. Because for me, as I said earlier, it is very wrong to say that the people who voted for either side did not know what they were voting for. I am categorically sure that people who voted for William Ruto and Kenya Kwanza know his history, and they know what he's done. They know how he's made his money. The fact that they knew that and they still voted for him tells you that sometimes history can be privileged. So even if we know what happened in 1992 and the whole liberation, what the population of the citizens are telling you, we are not indebted to that. That happened, fine, thank you. Thank you, sir. You gave us this constitution, you gave us all these nice things, but you know what? The way we are thinking at the moment, we are thinking very different. I think that's where we need to have the discussion. Like, at what point are the people sitting down and saying, you know what? This thief is better, you know, than this liberator. For me, that's where the issue is. Like, where did the rain start beating us, where people started seeing thieves, saboteurs, you know, and everything as their perfect leaders? You look at the current composition of parliament. I think Nation did a very good piece. We have like 70 people who were all carrying almost capital offenses in parliament, but they're going to be our leaders, you know. So that whole aspect has the average voter just given in and said, you know what? There's a deficit of integrity, so we will choose whichever one to choose. I think for me, that's where the conversation should have.
We're going to start. So thank you for that. This clarifies some of the responses to the questions. This clarifies some of the questions, complicates others, but we're going to move into Q&A first with a question from Alfred. Alfred, your hand is up. Just unmute yourself.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting debate. I have more comments rather than questions, if I'm allowed to comment. I'll make only 2 points, and I think what the speakers have spoken about are more of the functional issues, and I'll go more on the sort of structural, but also try and think about these elections or where the country is. In my view, I think we are trying a very huge experiment in political development terms. We are a young nation, and when I say we, I'm also a Kenyan. We are a young nation struggling with a very huge experiment, which even countries that sort of came up with this system are still struggling with, you know, handling an election, trying to vote all this or try to bring in leadership in nation and governance is a huge experiment. So I don't think we are there as a nation trying to deal with this. Perhaps things like the negotiated democracy, what we see happening in the North, I think that's where we are, you know, but trying to get universal suffrage on some of these things is just so contested, and it degenerates a lot of conflicts, which even the state finds it difficult dealing with. And I know that's a bit controversial, but yeah, we can discuss more about that. The second thing is politics. Really, I don't know whether it's elections or really it's just about politics of the belly here. You know, a lot of these leaders, where are they coming? Why are the politics so contested? It's because, you know, we are trying to really just get people to access power, economic power, to enrich themselves, you know, in a huge way. Nobody has, I don't think, a leadership agenda there rather than just getting into power. And I say this because even if you look at past elections, like in 2005, where we were voting for a new constitution, the electoral agency was able to manage that election without so much fuss. You know, they did it efficiently. They released the results very quickly, you know, because the contestation wasn't about power, but rather it was a nation collective conversation about how we want to govern ourselves. And in my view, I think I wouldn't say that we throw away the electoral process, but I think one of the, maybe some of the solutions to deal with this problem is maybe to separate the national election from the county elections and maybe hold them separately, so that you destabilize or you reduce some of the, you know, why should I, for instance, I come from Nyeri County, why should I care about Mombasa politics, you know, and the leadership there? You know, we should start building how we bring leaders from the county level, and then maybe at some point we can think about national elections, you know, at a separate time, you know, and then also decentralizing power from the, you know, from the center. A huge, let me say, setback from the current constitution in terms of the two governments that have been trying to implement this, was to drawing back the spirit of that constitution, which was to decentralize power from the center. But that meant that the leader won't probably be having a lot of the power that they had in the previous constitution. So they have eroded those gains and tried to decentralize power from the counties back to the national. And that's, I would say that is a matter of people because they didn't know anything else. A lot of the leaders here have been there since you know, let me say, from the colonial, post-colonial period. So they didn't know how to deal with a new conversation that has been generated by the new constitution. So those are my my few comments.
Mariga, do you have a rejoinder to that? You look like you're itching.
I'm thinking about it from so back to his last point about centralization of power. That's been a very big thing, right? So if you go back to something like the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, right, is a very good example of the Uhuru government literally grabbed power. They literally took back the central county. So the governor was left there on paper, but in practice now the central government controls it. The central government in many ways still controls what, over just close to 80% of the national kitty. Devolution was supposed to distribute power, but when you still have the central government under the president controlling 80% of the money, then he uses it he's been using it as a control, right? Many ways you can use, and that's why many independent institutions, for example, have been accused of being, many independent institutions have been accused of being used by the central government for control. The question is, how do you, I'll shift into a very interesting conversation, Bill, about what he said. So right now, if you look at the composition of parliament, right, we have an almost 50-50 split. There's a majority with Kenya Kwanza, but there's still an Azimio split, right? Which means that if you need votes at any specific point, it will require negotiation at best, right? So in theory, this means that there should be a check and balance like in parliament, as opposed to no one can bulldoze anyone in, right? So at this point would be a very good space, for example, for the negotiation of how much money goes to counties. However, this discussion is always like brought, the discussion, members of parliament are many times bribed just around this specific time, around the voting time. That's when bribery happened. And the parliament, which is supposed to be a check for the executive, moves backwards. So they're not able to, like right when after this election is over, it will be a very crucial point in determining whether counties have power and whether counties have financing. But the question is, how do you make parliamentarians independent enough, and how do you strengthen the opposition at this point to be able to create that check and balance? Because the last government bed did not have an opposition. When the candidate you're running against comes into your party, then you can pass any bill you want. Remember the 2019 Finance Act, I think it was, yeah, just 2020, where they had issues over where to take the money, and the voting was moved from a secret ballot to acclamation. Now, when you look back at the videos, no won. Like Nay was literally won. They were overshadowed by Yay. They sneaked it in and kicked everybody out. And they literally, like, when you look at the lack of democratic process, even within parliament, it was like a very clearly rigged process in like broad daylight. So my question is, how do you build up on that in terms of, because Alfred is a bit, I can see skepticism around the current form and perhaps talking about like the movement towards negotiated democracies. But I feel like even in the current form as we are existing, we do have very many mechanisms, if implemented, to keep the executive in check. The question is, for example, now, if we know that the next fight for the frontier will be where the budget goes, and that if governments receive way more money, then the counties have way more say and becomes independent from the central government, how do we at this point force our members of parliament to start implementing checks and balances over the executive before anything else moves forward?
I think to what Alfred and Mariga have said, in my opinion, the way we've conceptualized leadership in terms of our society, I think it's what creates all these problems. And I say that because in our society, I think it's not just Kenyan society alone, I think it's everywhere. Results do matter a lot. When a leader, at the end of 5 years, you're supposed to do a spot check and you ask, okay, so what did you do for us? I think there was a classic incident this year in the campaign when Nairobi woman representative Esther Pasharis went to campaign in a slum called Dipsy in Parklands, and she was kicked out. And people were chanting, asking her, what have you done for the 5 years as a woman, you know? And this whole Supreme Court ruling that said the CDF Act is against the Constitution and they need to take away that money. What will the MPs be telling people they've done? Because they've been using this CDF to say we've built toilets, we've built classes, you know, we've done ABCD. And you go back to the national leadership and you look at President Kenyatta, Mariga mentioned NMS, you bring in the military to give you short-term goals. You know, the military has constructed maybe 15 hospitals in Nairobi within a span of 2 years. The jury is still out about the viability of those hospitals, whether they are working. Yes, there's some that are doing it, but if you read the reports, it hasn't been. So in terms of results, you're like, oh my God, yeah, they've delivered the hospitals. But when you look at the process with which these results are being achieved, there's a lot to be desired. When the president turned to the military, we all understand that the military, the way it works, it doesn't understand the process. For them, we are passing through this road and this is what we're gonna do, yeah? And perhaps the way the whole heavy infrastructure development we've seen in counties, that is a classic case of governors wanting to, because when you listen to them, we've built a stadium. I come from Bungoma County. There's a massive stadium that has been built. And when you ask the governor to what value is this stadium going to add to the society, they don't have an explanation to that. But people want to see you've built something, you've done something, because for optics purposes, that is a result. I think we need for Parliament to keep playing an oversight role. I hope whoever comes into power will be more assertive and effective in terms of the rule of law. We know our Parliament can be rogue and they will try to bend, twist the executive to accept some of this thing. If Parliament's role was to legislate and oversight, and they actually know that is their role, and you remove all these other CDF shenanigans that they make them do, whatever, I think we shall have an effective oversight and opposition to look at the executive. But so long as the executive falls to the whims of parliament, I am very skeptical that we might have an oversight role by parliament.
I just pick up on what Silvana said. I find that very interesting, and it also goes back to what Mariga was talking about, class mobility and education. Leaders generally have a huge challenge, because if you want to work on structural issues that are now going to deal with long-term economic development, long-term growth, things like the things that you would have to focus on are really not the processes, and their processes that take very long, and they might not necessarily give you any results that you can go back to your constituents and say, look, I built this road for you. Maybe you'll start citing figures, oh, I improved the productivity of my farmers by 0.6%, and nobody, great, thanks. So that's like, it's a challenge, and it's an inherent thing that is in our system, because even that infrastructure is really, really, really needed. And if we talk about the soft processes, that's when we have the problems about corruption, funds disappearing, etc. But one of the things that I found interesting and hopeful about this election was that in the way they structured the economic plans, you could see that there was a little bit more reflection about how we can go about doing the things that they've been promising they're going to do for a long time, like the plan for the Hustler Fund. It has a very unfortunate name, but I think the idea behind it is really worth, if possibly they could be able to implement it, or to whatever extent possible, they'll be able to do it. I think that honestly, it's one of the best ideas I've seen coming out of the policy spaces, because it goes a little bit further than what we get NGOs telling us about building capacity and more building capacity, and what governments say, which is whatever they write in their long plan, in their development plans, which may or may not be implemented. So yeah.
So we've run out of time, but I want to close out with at least a reflection on what is coming down the line. And the reason I say reflection is because we've been here before. An election is run and then challenged at the Supreme Court. We've been, so it's a reflection. It's a preemptive reflection. We have now 9 petitions at the Supreme Court. As you close out with your final observations, what does that mean? What are some of the cases that are being presented? Some are very interesting. I've been skimming and reading through some of them. Others are raising rather milquetoast questions. But what are we looking at as we're heading and past the? Should we see what happened in 2018, where the Supreme Court ruling ended up being to the executive just a guideline to be ignored, and the announced president-elect becomes president? What are we looking at exactly over the next 5 years? Mariga?
I think, first of all Kenyans are looking forward to the election. As I think we discussed earlier, I'm not particularly excited about election petitions because of the elongation of time and the unpredictability. However, in many instances, it does build up. We are now at a space in our election period that was a reflection of a lot of election petitions going back, right? The most effective one for me would be the presidential election petition by Raila, and the minor KIA case, which has been touted very clearly, but also there's the much less touted one by Katiba Institute and AFRICOG, when they sued the Attorney General. And the case basically said, it basically brought a precedent for what happened in 2017 on the analysis of process, and process being significant on its own, right? So that's one of the most interesting things I'm going to look at, because I've seen process and transmission as the center of many of these, the petitions, the 9 petitions has been brought out. But to Kenyans, I think one of the biggest shifts I would like us to have from this election, and I feel will happen over a while, is realizing that elections are just one of the processes in a democratic process. We usually see elections as a be-all, end-all. In fact, that's one of the biggest catches, one of the biggest challenges that we'll have over the next 5 years. are institutional challenges and holding the government to account. And in many ways, those turn out to be more crucial and more effective because, as Kristin said, right, I come from Nyeri County. Nyeri County has a very high turnover rate. In fact, in the last election, I think only Kanini Kega remained from the whole county. They'll kick out everybody from the election, and they do it very often. But just merely voting in new leaders doesn't solve the problem. You vote new leaders, that's a very good thing, but you also hold them accountable and create systems and structures and institutions that will hold them accountable and that will work irrespective of whoever's in that space. So I look forward to a movement towards that space.
Sylvanus.
For me, the election process is not over because we are into a petition, we're into a Supreme Court petition. For me, what I'm looking forward is the issue of accountability. Going forward, I will want to see people who have bungled the election to face the court of law. I'll be interested to see when you come out and say, shout and say this process, the process is of opaque nature. I think we need to interrogate this group of people, put them up on a stand of trial and ask them exactly what went wrong, because what they did could have lit the country into fire, So I don't want a situation where we will sweep things under the carpet and these things just go like that. I feel like we need to delve deeper into have an accountable process where we look back and be like, okay, what happened? What happened? Number two, political actors who assault electoral officials, again, they need to be prosecuted and brought before law, because we are reaching a situation where the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission jobs is becoming a very high risk job. And I don't think people forget that by the time Wafula Chebukati was appointed as the chairman, there was no single person who had been interested after what happened to Isaac Hassan in 2013. He was the only one who applied for that job, So we need to have a conversation on, when you lose the election, do you vilify the whole and put a target on people's lives, or when there's a contestation? I think we need to change the political culture in such a way that you disagree with the result and you say, I disagree with this result and I am going to court to contest the result. Where I disagree with Raila Odinga is that he has put a target on people's lives. His constant harassing of the IIPP officials contributes to the way some of them have been harassed and some of them even facing death. I think you can contest without saying Mariga is a thief or Mariga, because when you listen to the things people are saying on the streets, all those videos you see online, if Chebukati was to walk on the streets out there, he'd be lynched, or any IIPP person would be lynched. I think in terms of language, we need to be very careful from our political actors, how they say it and how they speak about their frustration without necessarily putting people's life in danger, because we are getting to a situation where nobody will ever accept, those jobs, yeah? And that accountability begins with people owning up to their mistakes. I don't think we've ever reviewed, after the 2007 nullification of elections, we never reviewed the IIPP. We went into a BBI and everything was hushed into tones. Then 10 years later is when you discover the IIPP chair was incompetent, yet you had a whole 5 years to reform this institution. Again, respect for the rule of law. The High Court ruled that the appointment of some of these commissioners was unlawful, but the process went ahead. And that's where we are having 4 commissioners dissenting, yet they are not even supposed to be in office in the first place. So I think going forward, we need to tie up these loose ends and just find a way in which we strengthen these offices, these independent institutions, so that they are beyond reproach and they are beyond perhaps interference from the political actors.
Kristin shall be closing us out, so.
Okay, so I just think about this very often, that the IBC is still under Wafula Chebukati, and his second-hand man, Sando, died. He was assassinated, he was murdered, and we moved on. And I always ask myself how it is possible, how we just continue as if this is something normal. But in any case, I'm really looking forward to the implementation, to the strengthening of the devolution and also the expanded role of women in government. I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out.
With that said, we went a bit above time by 8 minutes. So I'm thankful that you were patient with us. Thank you so much for attending this. There should be another one in the future. Thank you very much. Please keep in touch with the Center for African Studies. Have a good day.
Thank you.